A few years ago, a team of scientists took the most famous piece of cloth on Earth, and they did to it what you do to a crime scene. They scraped it. Not to read anything. There are no words on this cloth. They scraped it to pull out the one thing a body can never fully wash away. They pulled out DNA. And the DNA came back not human. Not entirely. That is the part that stops people. When the results came in from the lab, the single largest share of the animal DNA on the Shroud of Turin did not belong to a person at all. It belonged to Corallium rubrum, Mediterranean red coral, a branching red animal that grows on the floor of the sea, 100 feet underwater, off the coast of Italy and North Africa. There is coral DNA soaked into the burial cloth of a crucified man. And next to it, cats, dogs, chickens, cattle, wheat and carrots and species of plant from 3 different continents, some of them from parts of the world that Europe did not even know existed yet. The cloth that is supposed to have wrapped one body is carrying the genetic code of dozens. Now, I need to be honest with you about what that means, because the honest version is stranger than the clickbait version, and I am going to give you the honest version by the end of this. But first you have to sit with the fact itself. Scientists at real universities, publishing in real journals, ran the genetics on the most studied artifact in human history, and what they found reads like the manifest of a ship that visited every port on the map. Coral from the seabed, livestock from a farm, human DNA from Europe, from the Middle East, from Arabia, from East Africa, and from the far side of the Indian subcontinent. And here is the part that should really stop you. That swarm of impossible DNA is the least strange thing about this cloth. Because underneath the DNA, there is an image, a full-length photograph of a tortured man, front and back, burned into the fibers to a depth thinner than a wavelength of light, with no paint, no dye, no brush stroke, and no known process on Earth that can reproduce it. There is blood that arrived before the image did. There are 2 separate laboratories, using 2 separate methods, that came back with dates 1,500 years apart. And there is a second cloth, in a locked chamber in Spain, with a paper trail older than the shroud is supposed to be, carrying the same rare blood and the same wounds in the same places. None of this is a hoax someone cooked up online last year. Scholars have been fighting over these facts for a century. The question was never whether the findings are real. The question is what happens when you line them up in order. And by the end of this, you are going to understand why the DNA was never the mystery. It was the noise. The signal is something else. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let's start with the cloth itself, because almost nobody actually knows what it is. The first thing to understand is the scale of the thing. The Shroud of Turin is not a napkin. It is not a fragment. It is a single sheet of linen, 14.5 feet long and 3.5 feet wide, woven in a herringbone pattern, and laid out flat. It shows the front and the back of a full-grown man, head to head, as if a body had been placed on one half and the other half folded up over the face and down to the feet. And on that man, the injuries are catalogued. Not painted in the loose way a medieval artist paints suffering. Catalogued. There are more than 100 small wounds scattered across the back and legs, in pairs, consistent with a Roman flagrum, the multi-tailed whip tipped with little dumbbells of bone and metal. There is a wound in the wrist, not the palm, which is where a real crucifixion nail has to go to hold a body's weight, and which is not where medieval artists put it, because they painted the palms. There is a single deep puncture in the side, between the ribs, with a separated flow of blood and a clear, watery fluid. And around the scalp there are dozens of puncture marks, in a cap, not a band, as if something thorned had been pressed down over the whole head. Whoever this cloth wrapped was scourged, crowned, nailed through the wrists and feet, and stabbed in the chest. It is, detail for detail, the execution described at the end of 4 Gospels. For most of history, that was the entire conversation. It was a relic. You believed or you didn't. And then in 1898, an Italian lawyer and amateur photographer named Secondo Pia was allowed to take the first official photograph of the shroud, and when he developed the glass plate in his darkroom that night, he nearly dropped it, because the negative was a positive. I will explain what that means, because it is the hinge the whole modern story swings on. A photographic negative reverses light and dark. Your face on a negative looks like a ghost, eyes bright, shadows glowing white. When Pia photographed the shroud, the faint brown smudge on the cloth, the thing that in real life barely looks like a man, resolved on his negative plate into a clear, deep, natural human face. Which means the image on the cloth is itself a negative. It behaves like a photograph made 800 years before photography was invented, and nobody, in the century and a quarter since, has been able to say how. That single fact turned a religious relic into a scientific problem. And it is why, 80 years later, the most serious examination of any artifact in history was aimed straight at this cloth, which is where the DNA comes in. In 1978, a team of American scientists calling themselves STURP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, were given 5 straight days of direct access to the cloth. They came with the kind of equipment you point at the surface of another planet. And along the way, samples were taken, dust was vacuumed, fibers were lifted with tape. Some of that material sat in storage for decades. And decades later, the tools caught up, and researchers could finally do the thing STURP could only dream of. They could sequence what was on it. The first big genetic study landed in 2015, out of the University of Padua, led by a geneticist named Gianni Barcaccia, published in the journal Scientific Reports. His team pulled the dust from the shroud and read every scrap of DNA in it. And the plants alone told a wild story. They found genetic traces of at least 28 plant families: spruce and pine and fir from the cold north, clover and ryegrass and plantain from the Mediterranean, but also plants from the Middle East, plants from East Asia, and plants native to the Americas, which is a genuine problem because the cloth's recorded history runs through centuries when no European had ever touched an American plant. Then they read the human DNA, and it fractured into pieces. The people whose cells were on this cloth came from everywhere: Western European lineages, Middle Eastern and Arabian lineages, the kind most common today in places like Yemen and among the Druze, an East African lineage so rare it barely shows up in the databases, and a large cluster of lineages that trace back to the Indian subcontinent. One later analysis put the Indian fraction of the human DNA near 39%. Nearly 4 in 10 of the people who left their genetic fingerprints on this cloth had ancestry pointing not toward Jerusalem and not toward Rome, but toward the Indus. And then, in 2026, a second team went back to the original 1,978 samples and sequenced them with modern metagenomics, the technique that reads all the DNA in a mixture at once. And the animal results are the ones that made headlines. The single most abundant animal DNA was that Mediterranean red coral, a third of everything they identified. After that, in almost equal measure, house cats and dogs, then chickens, then cattle, and the plants were worse for anyone hoping for a simple ancient origin. Carrot was the single most common crop DNA on the cloth, then bread wheat, and then a parade of species that did not exist in the Old World before Columbus: maize, tomato, potato, peppers, peanut, banana, orange. So here is the honest answer I promised you. That is contamination. All of it. This cloth has been unfolded, kissed, handled, repaired, carried in processions, and displayed to millions for at least 700 years. And every hand and every gust of pollen and every drop of a restorer's meal left a molecule behind. The same 2026 study was blunt about it. The dominant human DNA they recovered did not belong to some ancient man. It matched the modern scientists who did the sampling in 1978. The coral was almost certainly tracked in from jewelry or trade dust. The cloth is not carrying a passenger list. It is carrying a smear of everyone who ever came near it. But sit with why that matters, because it cuts both ways. The genetics could not give up a clean human genome. There is no single person to read out of this cloth. The DNA is a wall of noise so thick that the one question everyone wanted answered, who was the man, is a question the DNA physically cannot reach. Which means if you want to know who was wrapped in this thing, you cannot ask the DNA. You have to ask the image, and the image does not answer the way anything else in the world answers. come back to that faint brown figure on the cloth, because it is time to look at what it actually is, at the level of a single thread. When STURP finished their 5 days, they expected to find paint. That was the reasonable bet. A medieval fake, however clever, is pigment on cloth, and pigment is easy to catch. So they hit the image with everything. Visible light, ultraviolet, infrared, X-ray fluorescence. They ran the fibers under spectroscopy, the technique that reads the chemical signature of a material by the way it scatters light, and the paint was not there. There is no pigment layer. There is no dye that's soaked in. There is no binder, no gum, no medium of the kind every painter in history has used to stick color to a surface. Under the microscope, there are no brush strokes, because a brush stroke pools color where it starts and stops and where lines cross, and the shroud image has no pools and no crossings. The color is not sitting on top of the linen at all. It is the linen. The image is nothing more than the topmost fibers of the thread, chemically changed, dehydrated, and oxidized, the way a slice of apple browns in the air or a sheet of paper yellows in the sun. And it is impossibly thin. When they measured how deep the discoloration goes, it went down about 200 nanometers. Let me put that in scale. 200 nanometers is smaller than a single wavelength of visible light. It is a fraction of the width of one fiber of one thread. The image lives only on the crown of each fiber that happens to face up and stops. The fiber directly beneath it, a hair's width down, is untouched white linen. Whatever made this image reached exactly the surface and no further. Nothing we know does that. Paint soaks, dye soaks. A scorch from a hot object chars through the cloth and glows under ultraviolet light, and the shroud image does not glow the way a scorch glows. Acid eats down into the fabric. Heat spreads. Every mechanism a forger had available in the Middle Ages, and frankly, most of the mechanisms we have available now either goes too deep or spreads too wide, or leaves a residue, or fails to make a coherent picture at all. This image goes exactly one fiber deep, leaves nothing behind, and resolves into a photograph. And here is the detail that quietly demolishes the simplest forgery theories. The blood went on first. Where there is a blood stain, real human blood, verified with the trauma chemistry of a genuine wound, there is no image underneath it. The body image simply is not there beneath the blood, which is backwards for a painting. A forger paints the figure, then adds the blood on top for effect. On this cloth, the blood came down onto bare linen, and only afterward did the image form around it, avoiding it, as if the wounds were laid down by a real body, and the picture was made by something that came later, and knew to leave the blood alone. That alone should be impossible to fake, but the image was hiding something none of them saw coming, and it took a machine built for the space program to find it. In 1976, 2 years before STURP even touched the shroud, 2 American scientists named John Jackson and Eric Jumper got hold of a photograph of it and fed it into a device called the VP8 image analyzer. You need to understand what the VP8 does, because the whole reveal depends on it. It was a piece of NASA-era equipment built to take a flat photograph and read its brightness as height. You give it an image, and everywhere the image is bright, it lifts the surface up, and everywhere the image is dark, it pushes the surface down, and it renders the result as a 3-dimensional relief. Point it at a normal photograph of a person's face, and you get a smeared, melted mess, because in a normal photograph, brightness means light, not distance. The bright spot on someone's cheek is just where the flash hit. It tells you nothing about shape. Jackson and Jumper pointed the VP8 at the shroud, and a man sat up out of the screen. Not a smear, not a distortion, a correct, coherent, 3-dimensional human body, with the nose standing proud of the cheeks, the brow above the eyes, the hands folded over the pelvis at exactly the right depth, the whole figure in proper anatomical relief. The machine had done nothing but convert brightness into height, which means the brightness of the shroud image is not random shading. It is encoded distance. The darker parts of the image are where the cloth was touching or nearly touching the body. The fainter parts are where the cloth was farther away. The picture contains, baked into how dark each spot is, a precise 3-dimensional map of the body it wrapped. Think about what that requires of a forger. A painter shades a face by intuition, by where he thinks the light falls. He does not, and he cannot, encode the literal physical gap between a cloth and a body he does not have, in perfect three-dimensional register, invisibly, across 14 feet of linen, in a code that no one would even be able to read for another 600 years until a machine existed to decode it. There is no artistic reason to do it. There is no way to do it by eye. And yet the information is there. Feed a photograph of the Mona Lisa into the VP8 and you get mush. Feed in the shroud and you get a man. So now we have a picture that goes 1 fiber deep, uses no paint, forms around blood it did not lay down, reads as a photographic negative 800 years early, and secretly contains three-dimensional distance data. Every single one of those properties is individually hard to explain. Together they describe an object that should not exist. Which is exactly why, in 1988, science tried to end the argument for good, and for a while it looked like it had. You already know how this is supposed to go. Everyone does. The Shroud of Turin was carbon dated, and the carbon dating proved it was a medieval fake. That is the version that made every newspaper on Earth, and it is the reason a lot of intelligent people stopped thinking about this cloth in 1988. Here is what actually happened, precisely, because the precision is the whole point. In 1988, a small corner was cut from one edge of the shroud and divided among 3 of the best radiocarbon laboratories in the world: Oxford, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. They dated the flax in the linen by measuring its carbon-14, the radioactive clock that ticks down in everything once living. And all 3 came back in agreement. With 95% confidence, the cloth dated to somewhere between the year 1260 and the year 1390, the Middle Ages. Case closed. The shroud first appears in the historical record in France in the 1350s, and the carbon said the linen was made right around then. For 30 years, that number sat on the whole subject like a tombstone. But look at where they took the sample. They cut it from one corner, from the very edge, from the single most handled, most repaired region of the entire cloth. The corners are where you grip a cloth to hold it up. And in 2005, a chemist named Raymond Rogers, an original STURP member who had assumed the carbon date was correct, tested fibers from that exact corner against fibers from the main body of the shroud, and they were not the same. The corner contained cotton and a dye and a chemical marker called vanillin that the rest of the cloth had lost. His conclusion was that the radiocarbon corner was not original linen at all. It was a medieval repair, an invisible reweave done by skilled hands to mend a damaged edge, mixing new thread into old. The 2026 DNA study I mentioned found the same thing from a different direction, dating mending interventions on the cloth to the 1500s and 1600s. If the labs dated a patch, they dated the patch, not the cloth. And then, in 2022, a different method walked in the door. A researcher named Liberato De Caro at the Institute of Crystallography in Bari, Italy, used a technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering. Instead of counting carbon, it measures the aging of the flax itself. Over centuries, the cellulose in linen slowly breaks down at the molecular level in a way that behaves like a clock, and X-rays can read how far along that breakdown has gone. He ran it on a shroud sample, smaller than a grain of rice, and the number did not come back medieval. It came back at roughly 2,000 years old. When he lined the shroud's molecular aging up against linens of known age, it did not match a medieval cloth. It matched a piece of linen recovered from the siege of Masada in Israel, dated to between the years 55 and 74, the generation of the crucifixion. So now you have 2 sciences pointing in 2 directions, 1,500 years apart. One counts carbon and says medieval. One reads the flax and says 1st century. They cannot both be describing the same original cloth. Somebody is dating the wrong thread. There is only one way to break a tie like that. You need a witness. A second object, tied to the first, that can be dated by a method neither lab used. And there is one. There has always been one. It is in Spain, and it is older than the argument. This is the part that goes quiet. In a locked chamber in the Cathedral of Oviedo, in northern Spain, there is a second piece of linen. It is small, about the size of a hand towel, roughly 33 inches by 21. It has no image on it. No face, no figure, nothing you would put on a poster. It looks, at first, like a dirty rag. It is called the Sudarium of Oviedo, and Sudarium is the Latin word for the small cloth that was wrapped around a dead person's face. The Gospel of John says one was left behind in the empty tomb, folded, apart from the other cloths. And unlike the shroud, this one has a paper trail. That is the whole reason it matters. The Shroud of Turin only appears clearly in the historical record in the 1350s, which is what gave the carbon date its foothold. The Sudarium of Oviedo can be documented centuries earlier. It is recorded in Spain by the year 631. There are accounts tracing it out of Jerusalem ahead of the Persian invasion in 614, carried through North Africa and into Spain. And by the year 840, a king named Alfonso II built a chapel specifically to house it. There is a written, witnessed history for this cloth reaching back to the 7th century, which is 600 years before the earliest date the carbon labs assigned to the shroud. Now here is why that 600-year head start is a loaded gun. Because researchers who studied both cloths found that they match. They share a blood type. Both cloths carry human blood of type AB, and AB is rare. It is the rarest of the main blood groups, uncommon in medieval Europe, but markedly more frequent in the Middle East. 2 burial cloths, in 2 countries, both stained with the same uncommon blood. They share the wounds. When investigators overlaid the stain pattern of the Sudarium, the cloth that covered a face, onto the face of the man on the shroud, the punctures and flows lined up. Teams working with the Spanish investigation reported dozens of points of correlation, on the order of 70 matching points on the front and around 50 on the back. The blood stains on the Sudarium are described as 1 part blood to 6 parts fluid from the lungs, the signature of a man who died upright, suffocating, the way a crucified man dies. The wounds on the scalp match a head that was pierced by something thorned. The 2 cloths are describing the same face, with the same injuries, bleeding in the same pattern. And they may share the same dust. Pollen studies on both cloths point to the same corner of the world, to species that grow around Jerusalem, including a thorny plant of the region that keeps turning up on the shroud as well. Put it together. Here is a cloth with a documented history running back to at least the 7th century, 600 years before the shroud's supposed medieval birthday, and it carries the same rare blood, the same wounds, and the same pollen as the shroud. If the Sudarium existed and was already ancient by the year 631, and if it wrapped the same head as the shroud, then the shroud cannot be a forgery invented in the 1350s. You cannot forge a match to a face 600 years before you have the face to match. The carbon date does not survive that. Not because someone shouted it down, because a second cloth, in another country, dated by its own paper trail, is holding the same evidence. Now, at this point, it is tempting to reach for the word conspiracy, to imagine the church hiding the truth, or a cabal of scientists burying results, or some grand cover-up of the most important object in the world. But that is not what the evidence shows, and the truth is stranger and quieter than a conspiracy, because there is no cover-up here. Every number in this video was published. The medieval carbon date was published, loudly, in the journal Nature. The X-ray date was published. The DNA was published. The blood chemistry, the reweave analysis, the Sudarium correlations, all of it sits in the open literature where anyone can read it and where skeptics fight it line by line, and they should, because that is how this is supposed to work. There are serious researchers who still defend the 1988 date and think the reweave theory is wishful. There are serious researchers who think the Sudarium match is looser than its champions claim. This is not a secret. It is an argument, out loud, and it has been for 50 years. So let me give you the honest shape of it, the thing the whole ladder was building toward. The DNA was never the answer. Remember where we started. The coral, the cats, the carrots, the 39% Indian ancestry, the wall of human lineages from every continent. That is contamination. It is real, and it is genuinely strange to see laid out, but it tells you almost nothing about the man, because the man is buried under 700 years of everyone else. The title of this video is true. The DNA on the shroud is, in large part, not human, and the human part is not one person. But that was the noise. That was the crowd leaning in over the centuries, breathing on the glass. The signal is the body. The signal is an image, one fiber deep, made of nothing, laid down around blood it did not paint, encoding a three-dimensional man in its shadows, dated to the 1st century by the aging of its own threads, and matched, wound for wound and blood type for blood type, by a second cloth with a history older than the forgery is supposed to be. Strip away the DNA, and that is what is left standing. Not a smear of coral and house cats. A crucified man, front and back, that no one has ever been able to reproduce, and no one has ever been able to fully explain. That is the real reason this cloth will not go away. Not because of what is on top of it, because of what is underneath. And maybe that is the part that lingers. Not the coral from the seabed, not the cats and the carrots and the far-off Indian lineages layered on by 1,000 years of hands, but the fact that the strangest thing about the most tested object in human history was never the exotic DNA that made the headlines. It was the plain brown image that has been sitting there in silence the whole time, refusing to be paint, refusing to be a scorch, refusing to go deeper than a single fiber, holding the shape of a body in a code we could not even read until we built a machine to read it. The DNA was the thing everyone could see. The image is the thing no one can explain. And now you have seen both. You have seen the wall of animal and plant and foreign human DNA, and you have watched it dissolve into what it really is, the fingerprints of the crowd. You have seen the picture that goes one fiber deep with no pigment at all. You have watched a body stand up out of a flat cloth in 3 dimensions. You have seen 2 dates 1,500 years apart, and a second cloth in Spain, older than the argument, carrying the same rare blood and the same wounds. You cannot unsee that. The next time someone tells you the Shroud of Turin was debunked in 1988, some part of you is going to remember that the carbon lab measured a repaired corner, that the flax itself reads 2,000 years old, and that there is a cloth in Oviedo that was already ancient 600 years before the forgery was supposed to have been born. The DNA was never the mystery, it was the distraction. And the thing it was distracting you from is still lying there, one fiber deep, waiting. So, here is the question I want you to answer in the comments. And be honest, of everything on this cloth, which one refuses to leave you alone? The DNA that isn't human, the image that isn't paint, the dating that can't agree with itself, or the second cloth that was already old before the lie was supposed to start? Type 1, 2, 3, or 4, and tell me why. And if you thought the cloth that wrapped the body was impossible to explain, wait until you look closely at the cloth that wrapped the face, on its own, in Spain, where there is no image to distract you and only the blood is left to read. That is the next video. Because the burial left behind more than one witness, and the quiet one may be the one that finally talks.